said to the producer, we would like 10 minutes to tell our story. 10 minutes. And they said, impossible. We can't do that. You know, we just don't have. And they said, 5 minutes. 5 minutes. That's all we ask. And they said, no, it's impossible. So they looked back at each other, and they looked at the producer or the person receiving them, and they said, have it your way. And they took over the station. They walked through the station, they said, we don't have arms, we don't want to cause problems, just teach us how to use the equipment and we'll let you go. By 7 p.m. that night, Oaxacan women and children were broadcasting. And it's one of the most beautiful moments. There's a film, it's called A Little Bit of So Much Truth. And I think this story inspires me and moves me, because I think that is what we as human beings, as people who live in communities, as people who are brothers, who are sisters, who are parents, need to see the world. To recognize that our job in this world is not to be right, but to be on the side of what's right. To realize that there is a lot of injustice happening today, because at times we are silent to it, even when we know we have the voice to speak. And so it's about the choices, the stories we choose to tell. It's about the choices we make in how we work our relationships with the world we live in, whether we see each other as brothers or whether we see each other as strangers, whether we see each other as competition or whether we see each other as interconnected and interdependent on one another. And so today, I think that's what exemplifies the need for media. An independent media means voice, means visibility, means having a different vision, means creating a bigger imagination of who and what we can be. And so I hope we can engage in that discussion today and come away not just with the same cynicism, but with a renewed vision of who and what we can be.
Thank you, Sylvia. You made reference to what media might mean in different cultural environments. And in your experience, having seen and having observed the relationship of independent media in Latin America versus independent media in Canada, do you see differences? Do you see distinct? Like I get this, you know, in your story, there's this urgency to take over the media and make sure that they're, you know, but and often, you know, we'll hear people complain about Canadian complacency. It's not urgent enough to make it a political issue, for example. Do you see that tension?
I'm a member of AMARC, and as a world movement, we see media as a social movement. We see media as part of the struggle to end inequality. We see media as an important, essential component to eradicate those structures of inequality that today shape our interrelations and even the way we can imagine our economics, the way we organize our society, who belongs, who's invited, who's an outsider. All of those things are all interrelated to media. But to answer your question, I think media, independent media, for us in Latin America, has been born out of struggle, just like here, except for we have forgotten in North America what that struggle looked like, what those few first people who had to occupy, you know, spaces at the university campus went through to secure those spaces so we can have a voice today. And in Latin America, the struggle is very much alive because colonization continues today. It continues in the form of trade agreements like the NAFTA, the CETA, the multiple bilateral agreements that are being signed in the name of development, right? That simply serve to stagnate our own vision of coexistence. In Latin America, we say that we need to instruct and create a vision of living well, not living better. Living well. Living well means living in coexistence, living within the limits of our environment, living within the respectful relationships that we need to develop and nurture among ourselves and the other sentient beings that cohabitate with us.
Thank you. Each of you provided some perspective on what I often see as conflicting realities, conflicting perspectives on public media. There's the public discourse, there's certainly the operational reality, the management aspect of it, and as well the government's perspective of media and how it chooses to use and use media. And often as we see, often these three realities aren't in alignment, particularly around how to keep this form of media sustainable. And so often we question the sustainability of commercial-free or independent media as being at the heart of all of this discussion. Based on what you've said, I want to get into a very big question. Would the level of per capita funding towards various forms of public broadcasting, for example, reflect the country's attitude towards democracy? And maybe I'll start with you, Tyler, because you made that connection.
Well, I mean, absolutely not. I mean, and this is what we found out through Reimagine CBC is, and the value of framing it as a Reimagine project as opposed to a Save the CBC project, which we've seen multiple times, and remains very, very important, organized by people like the Friends of Canadian Broadcasting. But this is what we found out, is that even if there's people and there's a lot of people in this country who don't support the CBC as an institution, or feel, based on fact or not, that it's unaccountable, that it's too big, that it's irrelevant, that it's paternalistic or out of date or X, Y, Z. But what we were hearing from people is even the people who disagree with the CBC as an institution, they understand the value of public media as a concept. They got that, like they understand that like the Toronto Sun is like a dumpster fire. Like they get it. Like they know it's a disaster. Like they know that like Fox News North, or like I call it Fox News North, it's Sun TV. They know it's a mess, and like they know that it's becoming an instrument of power for precisely the government organization that is cutting funding to the CBC. So I would say that like a 10% off the top cut to the CBC and the contributions it makes to our communities absolutely do not reflect Canadians' attitudes towards public media. And what they feel like it contributes to their democracy. It's just a matter of trying to engage in the kind of processes that I think, Sylvia, you pointed to, these really collaborative, very, very grassroots forms of organizing that recognize the necessity of media as a site of struggle, as opposed to something that's given to us. And I also want to point out, you mentioned that media in Latin American struggles has become a part of struggles. That's very different from the history of CBC here. Which was born very much out of sort of like a decree on high from a colonial commission, from a British commission. So it's a very, very different history, and the CBC, for all it contributes, remains a part of a colonial kind of citizenship tradition. But I think minimally, in being a public environment, we can at least begin to address those issues through the CBC, even though the CBC remains a part of that history. And we can turn it into the kind of grassroots space that Sylvia had referenced so beautifully, if we engage with it to a substantial amount, and then it will actually reflect what we feel it can contribute to our democracy.
With the slight difference in history, although in some ways, Sylvia, one of the best stories of my memory at CBC was actually during, although the lockout at CBC was not a wonderful thing, one of the interesting things that came out of that is when the employees were locked out and they started producing media. And I remember being in meetings where the managers were like, "Did you just see these webcasts and these blogs?" And I'm like, "What did you expect? We have the world's best broadcasters. You've locked them out. They're going to find some other way to broadcast." Right? And the stories that they were telling and sharing in the community they were building was actually quite phenomenal. So you're absolutely right in the sense that that media often is born out of a struggle. Sylvia, do you see a relationship between what we know as the CBC and independent radio? Like, although we talk about them as being in the same space as public media, is there more of a symbiotic or they're not the same for obvious reasons? Like, how would you describe that?
I would like to say that community media reflects a more radical perspective of what is needed. And I say I'd like to say that because it is in some ways, but sadly, more and more we are seeing a lot of our campus community media being places where people have forgotten, what it means to have that privilege position, to be there, to have access to those microphones. And so it has become a struggle to see a true diversity of voices being reflected on those airways. And I want to give an example. At the 2010 International Summit, for Amark, over 115 countries are represented. The BDS motion came to the floor. And it was debated on the floor. It was unanimously passed with great fervor. People were really excited. Move forward a year later at the National Radio Conference in Canada. I moved a motion to have this motion looked at, debated, and it passed with a great majority. And yet, we have seen very little in the way of coverage, in the way of improved coverage of Palestine, in the way of the way we perceive this venue as a way to educate not just our audiences but ourselves of our own, I wouldn't say embodied biases, because we look at the world through our own lenses, through the things that we value. And so when we silence an issue such as the Palestinian occupation, issues such as where people are literally living in an open prison, we are saying something about who we are. We are saying something about how fear defines what we feel is allowed to be spoken of, what voices we invite, what voices we silence. And I say this with all the care and compassion for ourselves, because I know that we also face a lot of more difficulties. Most of us do media not because we're paid for or paid to do so. We do it because we care. We really want to create a society that's inclusive, that's pluralistic, that moves beyond simplistic reductionist notions that the conflict in the Middle East is just about culture and religion, that sees inequality as central to that sees colonization, that sees the power imbalances as central to the way we are pit against each other. And so it is really in that sentiment of camaraderie, of friendship, of brotherhood that I invite us to realize that the only time we're strong is when we stand together. The only time we're strong is when we see beyond our fears and when we act collectively. And I just think that is what unites us. That is what strengthens social movements throughout Latin America. In Argentina, at the conference, we talk about the disappear and what it meant to have radio in Argentina during the Pinochet years. People had their radio equipment in one office and the other door and two doors. And when you heard that the police were coming, you move your equipment from here to the other room, and they would go there and they'd steal everything that was there, but you had already moved. And so it was this constant running, right? Running. And that's what most people who are marginalized in the media, that's what most people who struggle, immigrants crossing borders because they're being made illegal. There's no such thing as illegal people, but we use the words carelessly. We allow them to roll our lips without thinking of the consequence and the connotations and the constant things we perpetuate to that. So it is a space that we need to recolonize, reimagine as decolonize, right? A space that it begins with us decolonizing our own ways of seeing and being in our society.
Thank you. I want to just put some attention now to a study that came out in 2009 by Nordicity, which is a large consulting firm out of Toronto. And in 2009, they did an analysis of per capita spending on the CBC compared to 18 other major countries, and what it learned was that Canada is the third lowest per capita. So that meant that per capita spending was at $34, and at the highest end, Norway, which was spending $164 per capita.